Rashawn Ray is a professor of sociology at the University of Maryland, and he joins us now. Thanks so much for taking time to be with us this afternoon. We just heard from Suzanne, Democrats making the case this is big enough of an issue to change the rules, that voting rights is a big enough issue, that the rules should be changed, that it can pass with a simple majority. Do you believe that's the right tactic at this time?
I think so. Well, first, thanks as always for having me on. I think so. Look, this is a civil rights issue. Voting is one of the most fundamental things that we can do as Americans, and it's been very clear that that has not happened for certain Americans. I think we need a civil rights exemption to the filibuster, and it's important for people to know that this exception has been made before for Supreme Court picks, for selecting judges, and it's unfortunate that when it comes to something as fundamental as voting rights, that there are some senators who don't want to get on board with this.
Right, because we have seen Republicans use essentially what's called a carve-out. It's a fancy term that they use on the Hill, but what they're essentially doing is saying these rules changes can apply to this one issue, but you have to have all of your people on board, and Schumer simply does not have Manchin and Sinema willing to do this. Where do you see him navigating from here if they can't get the rules changes?
Well, I think there's a couple of things for people. First, there have been a series of broken promises that Democrats have laid out. For example, this was supposed to be taken up on Monday. Of course, people are saying that MLK Day is a day on and not a day off to fight for voting rights. I think the other thing is that these broken promises have all those voters that came out for Democrats in last fall's election. They are a bit uneasy. They are unnerved. They feel as though that things have not happened. And we have to be clear as we approach MLK Day. MLK wrote in letters from a Birmingham jail. Victor Ray, who is a professor at Iowa, a non-resident fellow at Brookings, just wrote about this, that Sinema and Manchin are part of the white moderate that MLK wrote about, where he was saying that they preferred order over what was morally correct, and we are seeing that in this particular case.
And walk us through a little bit. We talk about these voting rights bills a lot on our shows. Walk us through what these two bills would actually do, some of the things that they would do, because instead of just painting with the brush, like, well, what would these things actually do, and why do you think that matters, especially to this particular constituency you're talking about? You're talking about Black Americans who overwhelmingly showed up in favor of President Biden in 2020.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is definitely an issue for Black Americans, but I think for all Americans. We saw in 2020 that even though Biden won over Trump, that more people came out to vote even for a Republican candidate than we've seen before. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act actually restores some of the rights that were taken away from the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That's really important for people to know. The Shelby versus Holder decision actually made it where the federal government does not have to provide oversight when localities want to make changes. That led to wide sweeping changes after the Obama election in North Carolina, Texas, Florida, Georgia, places where we know they are now purple battleground states. People are waiting in line for an extremely long time. The other larger part of the legislation ensures that equity is put in place so that people have the same rights to be able to drop off mail-in ballots, to be able to get to the polls, so that if they go to work, they will still have time after that to be able to vote. And again, look, voting is the most fundamental right we have as Americans, not just for Black Americans, but for all Americans, for people living in rural America who might have voted for Trump, who might favor some of the things that are going on. We need to ensure that everyone can get to the polls. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act, as well as the broader Act on Voting Rights, will ensure that. And it's unfortunate that not just those two Democratic senators, but even all of the Republicans who don't want to vote for it are voting against these particular legislations.
Right, and I think it is important to note that Republicans have blocked Democrats from even bringing this to debate on the floor several times in the last year. So we've heard from people like Kyrsten Sinema who want Republicans to get on board to talk about any potential rules changes, anything like that. But Republicans don't even want them to be debating this issue. And it looks like at this point that these bills just simply aren't going to get passed. So what do you think the potential impact is on upcoming elections? I mean, we're staring down at the 2022 elections in November.
I think it's going to be huge. Look, I think James Baldwin's quote is so poignant here. We hear what you're saying, but we see what you do. And part of thinking about that is we can't necessarily believe what you're saying because we see what you're doing. For Democrats, even though President Biden has been making these really emphatic and empathetic speeches, they don't go far enough because people are seeing what is happening in their local communities. They see that they're not going to have the same opportunities. And these are some of the things that Democrats promised Americans, that if you gave us Congress, if you kept the House, if you gave us the Senate tiebreaker, and also gave us the presidential election, we would do these things. And not only have we not gotten voting rights, but police reform failed at the federal level. Build Back Better is still stalling. And then, of course, we see images of Democratic senators meeting with Senator Mitch McConnell. These are the kind of things that are fueling. We see what you're doing, and we hear what you're saying. We hear that you're saying that you are backing Voting Rights Act, but you are unwilling to do the things that need to be done. And on the eve of MLK Day, part of thinking about this is this white moderate that he wrote about in Letters from a Birmingham Jail. People should go read that and see why we are having a repeat of history in this moment.
Rashawn Ray, we got to leave it there. Thanks again for making time. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.